If you want to measure bias in a language model, for instance, as a model creator, what do? You can pick one of the many metrics that exist and test for, say, gender bias. But then, which metric do you choose? What do you base your choice on? In our paper, we specifically look at one aspect that differentiates all these measures, and that is how actionable they are. So we look at the paper as a whole, how they situate and discuss specific aspects of actionability. Say, do they give an intuition about their values? If you have a bias of 8, is that good? Is that bad? Do you need to do something about this? Can you act on this result?
Pieter Dullebelle, and together with my co-authors Giuseppe Atanasio, Deborah Noza, Sulim Blodjet and Zirek Talat, we investigate if fairness metrics are presented as actionable or not, and we survey quite a lot of papers for that. So before we dive into the details of the papers that we surveyed, first we need to understand what actionability is. So we define it as the degree to which a measure's results enable informed action, and this informed action is key because there it really allows stakeholders, say a model designer, but it can also be an external stakeholder, to take an informed decision. So deploying a model or not deploying it because there might be too much bias in there, even taking a model out of production. So, of course, this relates a bit to other concepts from the literature. I'm not going to contrast all the concepts here explicitly, for that you can read the paper, but our actionability can support, for instance, accountability, and other concepts such as transparency are actually required for actionability because they require us to understand what we're measuring. So we came up with a list of desiderata for actionability. It's not necessarily that these are the only ones that exist, but we think this is a very good starting ground. For one, we think that a measure should introduce a motivation. This is typically done in a paper anyways, but we noticed that sometimes this is lacking. Why is a new measure introduced? Like, are you trying to measure something new? The second is that we expect the paper to be clear on what a measure is exactly measuring, so the underlying bias construct. We expect the paper to clearly have, say, a bias statement or something that says, okay, we're going to measure this aspect of bias, say gender bias, for instance. The third aspect is that an interval and an ideal result should also be reported, because if you have a measure, it typically produces a result, and which values can that result take? What's the target value? What's good? What's bad? So what's the ideal? The fourth desiderata is the intended use. So typically in a paper you can also say, okay, we intend this measure to be used for something, for measuring bias in a specific context, for measuring bias of a certain type of models, say only generative models or only mask language models. And the final desideratum is the reliability. So if you run a measure and you obtain a result, how consistent is that result? How trustworthy is it? So this includes test-retest reliability, error margins, but it's also broader. So with these desiderata, we then took a look at a set of papers. So what we did was we surveyed the literature of the ACL anthology, and we found 146 papers proposing new bias measures, and we analyzed them based on all these desiderata. And we saw that a lot of papers are lacking one or more of these aspects. For instance, there are 20% of the papers that do not have a clear motivation. So why do they introduce the metric? You don't really know. So then, is it a metric that you want to use? Are they addressing something that other papers were missing or not? Who knows? The same with the intended use. A lot of them almost are not describing the use that they intend their metric to be used in. So that also makes it hard then to use the metric as a new interested party. Then We also saw that 25% of the papers are missing a construct definition. So for instance, a bias statement. So then you don't even know what you are measuring. They could be measuring gender bias, but do not narrow it down to what exactly. And that is a problem in itself, because if you want to measure something as a stakeholder, you want to know what you're measuring exactly, especially with bias, because it's such a vague concept. You need a very clear construct definition, and we saw that a lot of papers are missing that. Similarly, the papers that are discussing reliability, that's really not a lot. That's only 19%, so 1 in 5 papers is discussing reliability. For instance, test-retest reliability, or providing some error or significance values. This is better with papers that use reliability as a motivation explicitly. So some papers say, okay, if you use this measure, it's actually not consistent or not reliable. So there we see that 42% of the measures use these reliability features, but still that's not even half. So in conclusion, what we see is that many papers fail to provide crucial details about their bias measure and how it should be used, which then leads to reduced actionability of the measure. So some examples, for instance here, the quote clearly says, okay, there is a part or one aspect of bias that has received less attention, and even with an example, and it immediately narrows it down. Okay, we're going to use slurs or offensive stereotypes. You clearly know what it's measuring and why you want to use this measure over others, because others are not capturing this. Some also provide a theoretical language model as an ideal language model, for instance. So then they give immediately a score that you know, okay, this score is the one I expect from an ideal language model with or without bias, for instance. So the stereo set paper does that very, very nicely. But then some papers also have what we call misaligned motivation and measure. There, for instance, we see that this motivation uses employment discrimination, so a classification setting where you have allocational harms. But then the measure that they actually introduce measures stereotypical associations. Both are fine to measure in principle, but if you read this motivation, you might be thinking, okay, I'm going to measure this and this could be useful, and then it turns out to measure something different, namely the associations. So in total, we have 5 recommendations for actionable measures. I already said it, but be clear about the motivation and use. So you need to explicitly state why you want to introduce a new measure, and define the scope of where it is applicable and where it is not. Similarly, you also need to be clear and select and report the theoretical construct that you want to measure, so the underlying bias construct, for instance with a bias statement. Then you want to relate the measures that you introduce to the consequences. So this goes back to the ideal language modeling score, for instance. Give a value and ground this value in the expected behavior. And also, if you can, explain what social ramifications this has. So for that you need to define an ideal score and also give the bounds of your score if possible. So then coming back to the reliability, we advise to always assess reliability. So test for consistency, testing, retesting reliability. And as I said before, only 28 out of 146 papers do discuss reliability. So this is really a big aspect that we can improve on as a community. And then finally, we also advise to consider the target audience for your measure. So take into account that different stakeholders have different needs. They can also only take varying actions. So if you're an external stakeholder, say a user of ChatGPT, you cannot use the same measures that OpenAI can use internally because you do not have access to the model in the same way. Because, well, different stakeholders require different types of actionability. So With these recommendations, we hope to set the tone for improving the bias evaluation metrics that exist currently in the field. And if you want to learn more, you can go to this website where we also link the paper.